Welcome everyone to another Meyer Sound webinar. Without further ado, let's get started. So today is going to be the second episode in a series of Constellation webinars. Last week we talked about Constellation for Education and Business. That webinar is currently available on our Thinking Sound YouTube channel, where you can watch it at your discretion. And that means that today, as always, we will have the venerable John Pellowe. John Pellowe, are you with us?
I am indeed, Merlijn.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Looking forward to another session. And today we also have Pierre Germain, Meyer Sound's Constellation Design Manager. Pierre, how's the connection?
Perfect. That's good.
Excellent. Thank you for joining us both. And that means that without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to John. John, take it away.
Well, thank you very much for joining us for this second discussion on Constellation. And I'm very pleased that my colleague Pierre Germain is able to join us today. So we're going to be talking about Symphony Halls. And there's nothing better than starting at the beginning with this. This is Zellerbach Hall in Berkeley. It's about 1.5 miles from our headquarters, and it's part of the University of California. In 2005, Cal Performances held their centenary performance, and they soon discovered that the wooden stage shell that accommodates the orchestra and has done for many years since the hall was built in the 1960s was far too small for the number of forces. I think they were doing Mahler or one of those big symphonies that wouldn't possibly be accommodated on the shell. And so John Meyer had the idea that we should install Constellation in this hall. It wasn't called Constellation then, but it was the first VRAS-based system that Meyer were deploying. And because we were putting it in as a temporary installation, it was all done on scaffolding pipes, which were actually, funnily enough, still up there 3 years later because everyone liked the result so much that no one wanted to take it down. And so it was 3 years or more before they were finally removed and the system was installed permanently. But Zellerbach Hall has been home to many great performances. And of course, that very first one with Cal Performances for the centenary was really helpful and to launching Constellation on its way. So the nice thing about it also is that the stage shell that they put up for the Constellation system is completely removable. If they have some sort of event that goes in there that needs every single flybar and every single square inch of stage space, they can take the system out completely. And that applies to an awful lot of Constellation systems. I'm just talking about the stage shell, of course, not the actual main system, which lives there permanently. So that's Zellerbach Hall. It's been really successful. We've had so many great artists come through this hall. We've had Gergiev. We've had a whole number of really big artists, John Adams, Kent Nagano, all sorts, and they've all loved working at the hall. This is the Berkeley Symphony, who use it regularly. And I'm very pleased to say that for the second time running, next year in March, God willing, and hoping that the COVID problem has disappeared, we've got the Vienna Philharmonic back there again with this time the great conductor, Gustavo Dudamel. So he's going to be back here in Berkeley, not for the first time, but it'll be very welcome to see him. Now, let's talk about concert halls and why we need Constellation. There are a few concert halls around the world. There's one, the Concert House in Berlin, that wouldn't be right for Constellation, and we wouldn't want to put it in there because it's already reverberant enough. It's not just about reverberation, but Constellation actually helps with strength. But these small, narrow halls have very high acoustic strength as it is already. Let's look at this drawing here. This is a shoebox concert hall, typically capacity up to 2,000 people. Look what happens when people make a sound on stage. The energy's returned very quickly, and it's also returned into the rest of the room fairly quickly as well. And there's a high density of early energy throughout the space. People have a satisfying listening experience because they have the strength, the acoustic strength, and they have a strong lateral fraction, which is very important for good acoustics. Now, when we go to fan-shaped halls, it's a completely different story. Here, again, we make a sound on stage. It's returned into the stage in this instance, but the energy gets scattered by the shape of the hall. And of course, this is only a very simple graphic example, but in very big halls, and of course, fan-shaped halls tend to be rather big, the energy dies very quickly. And so they're not satisfactory to listen in. There's a lot of examples of halls like this around the world, because although perfect acoustics might be obtainable in a 1900-seat hall like the Musikverein Vienna, it's very difficult to achieve good acoustics in very large spaces. And so maybe Constellation can help. I'd like to talk a little bit about stage shells. Now, this is the beautiful Academy of Music in Philadelphia. I'm sure they don't mind me using this picture. It's just to give you a typical example of what a stage shell looks like. The problem with stage shells is that if you have upstage instruments, and they're typically the loud instruments like brass and percussion and stuff like that, and the horns, of course, played backwards straight into the shell, those surfaces are quite reflective. And for people sitting near the conductor, they get a lot of energy from the instruments that are upstage. On the other hand, the strings and the instruments that are downstage don't have so much reinforcement from the walls. They don't have so much help from the walls. And therefore, the whole experience is unbalanced. So the upstage instruments tend to be very strong on early reflections and early energy. The downstage instruments are more reverberant, but less strong on energy. So we've got a problem there. How can we fix it? Well, Constellation can fix that, and we do so in our stage systems. And I'll tell you a little bit about that later on. Now, we have various techniques for variable acoustics. Of course, there's mechanical acoustics. We can add absorption or diffusive material. And of course, we can add variable volume with moving ceilings. These things are very, very expensive, and not so many people are building them now. We can have coupled rooms. Indeed, there are some really famous halls out there with big secondary chambers and doors that open, huge, heavy doors to change the reverberation time of the room. And of course, we've got acoustic shells that I've just been talking about. But the problem with all of these things is they don't produce that much reverberant swing from the very lowest RT time to the very highest. And nowadays, for so many different applications, we need a very wide swing of reverberation. Electroacoustic techniques, well, we've got inline systems that are non-regenerative, and we've got non-inline systems that are regenerative. Now, there's various different electroacoustic systems out there. Most of them are non-regenerative, as far as I can tell. But Constellation is a hybrid. It runs on both systems at once. Let me show you how. Our early reflection processor is an inline process. So you've got a performer on the stage. We've got audience on the right-hand side of the picture. We're going to capture the sound on the microphones placed just above their heads. We're going to process it, and we're going to return it to the audience via loudspeakers. And so you can see this process now. You can see how it's a one-way inline process. There's no regeneration going on at all here. The microphones for the performers are typically 5 meters above the stage. Now, the reverberation processor is completely different. It's a regenerative device. And the idea of this is that you've got your performer and the audience. Of course, the audience must always hear the performer before anything else, before any acoustic source. So first of all, what's going to happen is that you're going to see that as we turn up the gain on the microphones, the regeneration gets stronger and stronger and stronger. Now, I've shown this picture before, but I'm going to do it again because it's really important. Here's a multi-purpose venue, a typical one It's just a hypothetical illustration. We're going to put microphones above the stage. And I'd like to tell you that what we normally do with the stage is we split it up into 4 zones so that we can actually help people in the different zones hear each other. So we might call this zone 1, this zone 2, this zone 3, and this zone 4. And we can actually help musicians hear each other across the stage, which is very important. Those microphones, as I said, are typically 5 meters above the stage, and they're normally within the reverberation radius of the room. And of course, the reverberation radius of the room is very important because it's the point where direct and reverberant sound have equal value. So we need to be inside that, really, to get good quality sound from the performers on stage. And of course, then we put microphones above the auditorium, distributed throughout it. We're going to put loudspeakers around the auditorium to return energy. This is UP4 Slim loudspeakers. We're then going to put Ultra X20s around the stage to, again, form the walls of a stage shell. So you imagine that stage shell we were talking about earlier on in Philadelphia. If that wasn't there, you could have loudspeakers instead that would do the same job or better. And then we have, of course, overhead loudspeakers over the auditorium. In this case, this is Ashby 8s. And lastly, loudspeakers over the stage to form an overhead shell. And that is, of course, X20s. And we're going to then surround the building with subwoofers. Now, the most important thing that we have to think about here is not just creating a nice acoustic for the stage, but we have to make sure that the early reflections from the stage can be heard by everybody in the room very clearly. And so what we do is we have an early reflection processor over the stage. It's part of the stage system. And from that, we generate early reflections and we send them out across the room, obviously time aligned correctly to the stage to make sure everyone has a good level of strength and clarity. And of course, that's very important for creating a high EDT. We then, of course, have a reverberator over the stage. We have a reverberation processor that also feeds back to the stage itself to make the stage a more reverberant space. But it also, at the same time, it sends energy out into the room. But in addition to that, the microphones over the auditorium capture the indirect sound from reverberant energy, and they add reverberation to that as necessary using VRAS processors set into reverberation mode. So we've got lots of different ways we can make this work. And the end result is always, hopefully, that we can get really, really good quality sound for everybody in the room. Let's just look at some subjective terms used in acoustics. Reverberation, intimacy, strength, clarity, and warmth. We can change all of those things using Constellation. And it's just a question of getting the balance right between all of these things. So there aren't many things that you can do in conventional acoustics that we can't do with Constellation. In fact, we can do a few things that would be extremely difficult to achieve using conventional physical acoustics. And that's that we can change brightness, perceived height, and perceived width of the building. So that's a really big range of things that we can change given the technology that we've got available to us. Let's look at Russia. This is Svetlanov Hall, and this system was put in not because the hall wasn't reverberant. It was put in because nothing worked well in it. And you can see the loudspeakers here. I'm pointing to them. You can see the loudspeakers above the stage. You can see the microphones. But let's look at another picture of Svetlanov Hall. And I remember talking to a Finnish acoustician who I know very well about this hall. And he said to me, John, I walked into this hall and the first thing I thought is everything is wrong about it. He was right. Look at all these surfaces. They're all pointing in the wrong direction. They're pointing away from the performers. And the balcony fronts here. They're all pointing in the wrong direction. There's a huge volume in the room, and it's actually got a 1.8 second reverberation time, which is great, but there's no early energy. There's no energy down here on stage, which is where you need it. It's where it needs to originate from. The performance is going to sound great. So the Constellation system was put in, and we have loudspeakers that are on motors and microphones that are on motors. They can go up and down because Constellation isn't used for every single event. It was put in a while back now, and it's been very satisfactory. I like this quote from Maestro Spivakov, who's become a good friend of Meyer Sound. He's really happy that we've resolved the problem of the hall through the creation of a wide range of comfortable acoustic parameters so that any musical genre can be performed there without changing the architecture of the space. Now, Alexina Concert Hall in Tallinn. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this than I have on my previous webinar, where I just touched on it. The under balcony is very deep in this hall, and it has 54 loudspeakers. You can see them. I'm pointing to them now. You can probably see them. We also have 12 microphones under this balcony. So each under balcony has its own Constellation processor. It's a reverberation processor. We capture the sound under the balcony on those microphones, and we return it back into the space with added reverberation. By adding delay, we can make the balcony feel higher than it is. And this is always a problem with concert halls, that wherever you've got an under balcony, it's always kind of second-rate sound, because the reverberation in the main body of the auditorium isn't heard under the balcony. Underneath the upper balcony, we've got 84 loudspeakers and 12 microphones, because although it doesn't look it from this picture, it's actually deep and very shallow. And so because it's shallow, we need a lot more loudspeakers. And all of these loudspeakers are decorrelated from one another so that there's no connection between the sound coming out of two adjacent loudspeakers. They're completely decorrelated. That's why the system feels so natural. They've done many, many things in this hall, many different performances. They've had all sorts of people in here. This is the Nordic Symphony Orchestra with Anu Tali conducting. They are hoping to do many more concerts in there. This was last year. This is a quote from Ivar Seropu, the general manager. And he's really pleased with Constellation. And he says the reputation of Constellation has enabled us to attract prominent members of the classical music community, including Gergiev, Vladimir Spivakov, and others to perform in the hall. And they've gone on to recommend systems in other halls. And the one, in fact, in Svetlanov Hall that I was just showing you was as a result of Spivakov performing in this hall. The Jakarta International Theatre is a 2,500 seat, huge theatre in Jakarta, not surprisingly. And it's only just been finished. We tuned it last year, and we're really pleased with the results in this place. Fortunately, the acousticians, Walter Storick, they did a really good job of getting the reverberation time down, because it's difficult to do in such a big space. It really is. You know, they got it down to about 1.2 seconds, something like that. And the end result is great. We're able to do any type of performance in this hall. And in fact, the opening event was, believe it or not, a solo recital by Yo-Yo Ma. And he loved it. He was really happy, and everybody could hear. The owners of the hall had people listening in each balcony, in the back of each balcony, and scattered all over the auditorium. Even though it was a packed house, they managed to do that. And they said that everyone could hear well. And to give you a clue of the challenge for an acoustic instrument, this is a view of the stage. You can see how enormous it is. And that, by the way, is the smallest position that the stage can be in. It's the smallest configuration. Those side panels with the white lights on them, they open up and you can have an even bigger event. You can see, if you look carefully, you can actually see the Constellation loudspeakers. This was when we were rigging and tuning it. You can see the back wall of loudspeakers there. That forms the back wall of the stage shell. you can see the side loudspeakers that actually form the side walls. We've got some subwoofers on the stage. They were subsequently flown, but this was early on in the process of getting the hall tuned. And then overhead, you can see the overhead loudspeakers, and you can just about, it's difficult to make out the microphones, but they're all there. I think we've got over 20 microphones on the stage in this place. Here's another view taken high up in the fly tower, looking down at the stage system. So again, you can see the loudspeakers hanging overhead, forming the overhead shell. You can see the lateral loudspeakers. And at the customer's request, this back wall of loudspeakers can be moved. It can either be here or it can be much further up stage. So they can expand and contract the stage shell as they wish. And of course, like almost every hall, the whole thing comes out very easily. They can dismantle it, take it all away if they have a production that requires all that space and that they wouldn't use Constellation for anyway. So I've got to tell you another thing about this hall that's really successful is that they didn't forget the stage. The stage has very good acoustic treatment. You can see this metal grille on the back wall, and it's really good. It works very well. Not the grill itself, but it's holding back absorption. And so the walls are very non-reflective, and they've done a really excellent job of neutralizing this space. And I always ask people to do that. If you're going to have a fly tower, you want to make sure that whatever you put in it isn't going to change the acoustic of the room very much. So a very good way of doing that is actually to make the space fairly low reverberation to start with. Then when you add fabrics, you add scenery, you add whatever, it's not going to reduce the RT time very much because it's already fairly low. If, on the other hand, you say, no, we're going to leave this as a bare concrete shell and rely on curtains and properties and things like that to take the reverberation time down, the end result of that is that it's not going to be a stable space. And so we need to have stability for Constellation to work well and for the system to be predictable for obvious reasons. Now, the ASB Theater, I just want to touch on this because the volume of the room was changed quite dramatically in the closing stages of the design. And the hall in Tallinn that I showed you earlier on, they would have spent another 5 million euros had they made the volume of the hall bigger. And it still wouldn't have had a good acoustic underneath the balconies. We need good acoustics. We need good acoustics in the rooms that we put Constellation into. And if you've got a good company that's doing good work for the project, then that's great. We can put Constellation in and we can take the reverberation time up in incremental steps. They couldn't change the volume of the room. They did think about it, but they realized that a lot of people were sitting underneath balconies anyway. So changing the volume of the room wouldn't help that much. Marshall Day came back into the project, did it properly, and now the hall is really lovely sound. And in keeping with all of our Constellation rooms, we have very good control of the lateral fraction, the amount of lateral energy coming in from the sidewalls, and that certainly pleased the acousticians, who are very big proponents of a strong lateral fraction in halls. In fact, Sir Harold Marshall from Marshall Day actually really defined lateral fraction and how important it is for acoustics, and we're all grateful to him for that.
And just to add to that,
I'm showing.
You were mentioning that in the early slides, how Constellation is a regenerative system, and that's where it's important to have a good acoustic space to begin with, because Constellation will regenerate what the acoustics already are. So that's why having a really good sounding concert hall to begin with is only going to sound that much better once we add Constellation.
Absolutely. We can't, generally speaking, fix really bad acoustics. But I'm about to show you, when I am showing you one now, where we did. This was a room that was really built out of plasterboard and plywood. And the plywood was 1/2 inch thick. And that was it. Every panel that you touch in this room, it looks nice, but every panel you touch is just hollow ringing sound. And of course, what happened with this room, it was not only dry, but below 500 hertz, instead of a nice gentle rise in the bass ratio, which is what you expect in a nice concert hall, it went way the other way. And I think that the hall was something like 1.1 second or something like that in the mid band at 500, between 500 and 1000 hertz. But below that, it fell right off to half that, 0.6 at 125 hertz. So they said to us, what can you do? So we put a lot of subwoofers into this building. They're hidden everywhere. We also put a full Constellation system, and that enabled us to transform a space. But I have to say, we really do prefer to go into rooms that actually have a good acoustic to start with a low physical reverberation time. Then we're always a lot happier. It's not only easier to tune, calibrate, and all the rest of it, but we're just starting off in a better place. And of course, there are instances where you're going to want to switch your Constellation system off. You're not going to use it for every single event. There might be a rock show. I don't think you really want to use Constellation for a rock show, although people do use Constellation for amplified events, musical theatre and things like that, using a low reverberation time just to go with the PA system. And the two things work together really well. Now, I want you to look at this strange picture. This was actually before we installed the Constellation system in the Teatro Teresa Carreno in Caracas. And I discovered this on my phone the other day. And I thought, well, I should show you all this because it's an illustration of the crazy things they do in Venezuela, and bless them for doing these things. But there are actually 1,200 people on the stage there. Just trust me, it's 1,200 people. The stage is 40 meters deep, and they said to us, can you design a Constellation system for us? Because this theatre is super dry and no one likes performing in there. It's really hard work. Now, this was before, as I said, we installed the Constellation system. It was for a celebration in Caracas. But you can see that it's a really difficult challenge. So the way that we did this, we actually put two Constellation stage systems in. There's one upstage and one downstage, and the two are tuned to operate either separately or together. And the results that we've got with that have been pretty good. And I want to tell you something else about this room as well, in a little more detail. If you look very carefully, you can see where my pointer is. We've got some HMS 10 loudspeakers. These are horn-loaded loudspeakers. And underneath the walls here, you can't see them, unfortunately. They're hidden from view. We've got smaller MM4 loudspeakers. What we were able to do in this room, because it's so wide, it's 34 meters wide, we were able to set special delays for these upper loudspeakers to get early energy into the center of the room in good time, actually to slightly short circuit the natural time path between the stage, the walls, and listeners in the center of the auditorium. And because we were able to do this, it's suddenly a much better listening experience for everybody, no matter where you sit in the theatre. You're not like a lot of big fan-shaped halls like this. If you're sitting in the middle of the auditorium, you're at a loss for lateral fraction because the walls are miles away. Of course, you really notice that. And it was great. We really achieved some good results here. We were able to tune the system while they were rehearsing, which was really good because the stage was 40 meters deep nearly, and the pit in the front, and there was a lot to get together for this. But we did it, and we were really happy with the end results. And it's a 26 meter wide proscenium. So that's quite an achievement. I'm really pleased with that. And it's the second largest theatre in South America, which is very cool. Now we go to China, and this is Shanghai. This is Nine Trees, and it was only opened last year, and the people there are very pleased with it. They had an opening event, and it seats 1,200 people. It's not massive, but it's still a very good size, and you can see the orchestra at the opening event here. Now, I wanted to show you this picture because you can actually, in the background, you can see behind the scrim, you can see the lateral loudspeakers for the stage show. And then there are lateral loudspeakers at the side here and at the other side as well. Now, of course, they could put a different type of scrim and a different type of lighting there where you wouldn't be able to see them at all. And a lot of customers do that. But I just wanted to show you that anyway, so you can get some idea of how the speakers relate to the musicians on stage. Pierre, would you like to tell us a little bit about Soundbox?
Sure. Just while you're still on Nine Trees, maybe if you back up a couple of slides, just wanted to talk about the process. We work very closely with the architect and the acoustician. If you go back to the previous one, there we go. So as you can see, all the loudspeakers are very carefully hidden. And what we do at Meyer Sound is we test acoustic fabrics or any fabrics that are intended to be placed in front of loudspeakers. So what you see, there's the white balcony front. You might see the outline of some speakers there, but also the red portion that you see on the sidewalls have some loudspeakers embedded in the walls. And it was a combination of a metal grill with a fabric in front of it. And I still have the prototype sitting in my office because it's hard to dispose because it's about 6 feet by 6 feet. But that's a very typical process that we do as part of our Constellation integration process, is to make sure that if there's a desire to hide the speakers, then we do a lot of testing of the fabrics, and we've accumulated a list of what fabrics we prefer to use. If there's other fabrics or grills that want to be put in front of loudspeakers, then we'll do some testing in our laboratories. So this is just a good example of Constellation not really imposing itself on the architecture. When you look at this photo, you can't tell that there's a Constellation system involved.
No, that's great. It's a very attractive building as well. And I'm so glad that this has been a success, because it will lead to more projects in China for sure. Now, Pierre and I have both had a lot to do with Soundbox, but why don't you, well, I'll tell you what, I'll start off the story just by saying that years ago when I was at Decca for a long time, between 1986 and 1993, I was recording the San Francisco Symphony in Davies Hall. And this building is right next door to it. And at the time, I remember coming into this place a few times. It was designed for rehearsals. It was designed for opera rehearsals and for symphonic rehearsals, but no one liked it. And I think it was principally used as an instrument store or for building scenery and stuff like that for the opera, which of course is just across Van Ness Avenue. Anyway, I just wanted to say that this room was never liked by anybody right back in the late 80s and early 90s because of its acoustics. And so I'll let you take it from there, Pierre. I'll move to a different slide, though. Yeah,
sure. Well, actually, you can stay on this slide because the origin, my first visit to Soundbox was the room as you see it now. What you see at the bottom left side is the orchestra pit where they do the opera rehearsals. And then obviously the symphony will rehearse on the upper side on the right. And it very much looks exactly the way it is now, but obviously now we've incorporated Constellation. And the idea was to create a new space, and the idea came from Michael Tilson Thomas, the conductor from San Francisco Symphony, to create a new venue where it would be kind of an unusual and a new approach to bringing classical music from the entire breadth of history, from the classical to the traditional to the contemporary, and as well as electronic music, just to bring it all together and in a more informal gathering. So what you see as the stage on the right, our approach to designing Constellation was to approach it like one big stage show. So we used the same approach, the same microphones, the same speakers, but due to the size and the width of the venue, we actually put 2 rows of laterals. So if you can see the white beams on the left, there's 2 rows of those beams, so that we have larger speakers or UP Juniors on the upper ones, and then we have the MM4s or smaller speakers or close to those lower beams. And that way, you're able to get very similar to Teresa Carino, where we have kind of a short throw with the small speakers and a long throw with the bigger speakers. So you see an example of one of the early performances of Soundbox, and now we're seeing it from the other side. There's obviously a giant screen that is now separating the side of the orchestra pit. And you can see the trusses and the lights overhead. And so obviously the microphones and loudspeakers are sharing a lot of those same trusses with some additional microphones that are going in between. So that was the original one of the original performances, there were 2 stage locations, actually technically 3, but the main one is one you see here, and also at the back of the room where you see those 2 smaller screens. They will also set up there, and they'll go back and forth between the performances. And in some cases, they've had performers show up right in the center where they'll put a smaller stage. And in some cases, I was actually standing near the bottom left of the slide, and a violinist showed up beside me and started playing. So the musicians can play from everywhere. There's another example here is Michael Tilson Thomas himself. He always does an introduction to the performance. If he's part of it, they've had a lot of guest conductors and guest composers come in and do the curating of the pieces. So you can see here that it's a very much a multimedia experience. So there's projections in addition to the music. A few years ago, they started incorporating overhead projections. So now you're fully immersed in the multimedia experience. They actually also added some screens that are on the wall that's facing the 2 that you see on the left-hand side there. So here's a typical view of what you see when you enter. The tickets sell out very quickly, and it's first come, first serve in terms of getting the seats. So you have a choice of banquette seats that you see on the bottom, or sitting on small kind of ottomans in the center. And you can see that the table in the middle of the room, that is where they will be doing some performances if the event actually calls for it.
Yeah, just to add, it's great that we can actually, as the location of the performers moves around, that the early reflection system can go with it, so that people are always, the sound is always focused in the area that it should be. I think that's a brilliant thing about this system.
Yeah, definitely. That required a little bit more calibration, a little bit more time on site. That's something we've done typically for a lot of multi-purpose rooms that I'll be discussing next week, where we actually reconfigured Constellation to match the room. So if the stage location changes, we can actually change the origin of the early reflections. Due to the success of Soundbox, actually created a lot of attention around the country. And the next venue that we worked on was Octave Nine. So as you can tell, it's a completely different looking space. It's very small. It'll accommodate up to 150 people. It's the Seattle Symphony's new concert venue. It's part of Symphony Hall in Seattle. So they'll do everything in here, from conferences to dinner gatherings, all the way to compositions, small quartets, and also using our space map technology, they're able to utilize all the loudspeakers in the space to do creative sound art or compositions where you have unique sounds coming from different parts of the room. The room can be completely encapsulated in a circular screen. I believe there are 13 screens that will actually kind of like telescopically wrap around the room as needed. So here's an example of kind of a wider screen. I believe the next one is more of a kind of a corporate event where they'll be able to shrink it. Oh, sorry, this is another one. So this is an example of where everybody's completely enveloped. I'll say this is early rendering, but they've been able to do a lot of these interesting projections, because during the design process, we had to make sure that we weren't intruding on the lighting locations, the projector locations, HVAC locations. So there's a lot of careful design to incorporate our typical overhead layout, along with loudspeakers, small loudspeakers, subwoofers, microphones, and then on top of that, all the other things that go into typical rooms, such as lighting, and in this case, projectors. So here you have an example of a corporate event, and everything is very, as you can see, very modular. They'll bring in chairs as needed. They do put loudspeakers on the floor as well. So when they do musical performances, they'll let the people enter the room, and then they have themselves a very, very full experience. So here you see an example of a string quartet playing with some projections. So it's a very unique system. And what was very interesting in terms of the acoustic design, which was done by Jackie Holden. Go to the next slide to see the ceiling structure. So you can see here, it's actually kind of like this honeycomb, but that is all made out of, I believe, 1 inch of felt, creating all those different leaves, if you will, of the honeycomb. And felt is a very good absorber, and it helped contribute to reducing the reverberation time of the space. So along with the carpeting, the absorption on the sidewalls, and the ceiling that you see here, it reduced the reverberation time to about 0.5, maybe a little bit less. Which is a perfect starting point for a room of this size for Constellation, because then we can just make it, bring it up a little bit for any type of conferences or any type it's used for speech. So we have a voice lift setting for that, and then everything from a very short chamber music to long reverberation to make it sound like a cathedral, where we incorporate what John was talking about earlier in terms of raising the apparent ceiling. So by putting delays in the overhead speakers can give the impression that now that ceiling is no longer at 10 feet. It's actually more like at 60 feet. And so here you see the map of the ceiling itself. So the big purple dots are the projectors. So that's why it was a lot of careful coordination to make sure that we could all live in the same space, which was done beautifully. It was great coordination between the architects, consultants, and ourselves, just to make sure that everybody had their own place and everybody had enough room to put their equipment.
Yeah, and something I'd just add to that, Pierre, when you've got a 10-foot high ceiling, as indeed you have under the balconies in Tallinn, and there are others as well in various systems, it's really good if you can make those surfaces fairly absorptive. If they've got a very strong reflective surface, it's rather difficult to create the illusion that the space is bigger. But if the surface is absorptive and therefore the first reflection isn't too strong, then you can actually create this illusion of the space being bigger, because you can delay the loudspeakers and you're not aware of the surface right above your head. So that's something that they've obviously done a very good job of in Octave Nine.
So Singapore Conference Hall, it's been around since the 1960s, and it was originally a conference hall for exhibitions and that sort of thing. It was very much a government building. Today, it's declared a historical landmark because it's been around for so many years. In the late 1990s, the Singapore Chinese Orchestra was looking for a new home, and they did some renovations in the conference hall to make it into now this performance venue for the Singapore Chinese Orchestra. The issue, however, was since it was originally designed acoustically for speech, the reverberation is quite low. It's about 0.9 seconds. Despite all the wood surfaces that you see, there is quite a lot of carpeting, and the seats are very absorptive. There's absorption up in the ceiling above the white panels that you see there. We implemented Constellation in 2017. And here you see an example of when you look at the stage shell, it does follow that traditional trapezoidal shape. And that's what I wanted to point out is we've showed slides where stage shell kind of had this rectangular shape to match flight towers, but we can also accommodate the shell to kind of match the architecture and do some trapezoidal shapes like this. And another thing that's important to note is you can tell in this photo, there's these little side seating areas, which are VIP booths, where we had to make sure that we were covering these areas as well with Constellation. Like I said, in 2017 is when we first deployed Constellation into the initial tuning. It's now home to the Singapore Chinese Orchestra, and it's been a great success. We've had a lot of really good feedback from all the performers there. So here you're seeing a shot from one of those performances. Here's another example. And I had the pleasure of returning to the venue in 2018. And unfortunately, I don't have a photo of it, but the famed violinist, Joshua Bell, as a Grammy Award-winning violinist, did perform a piece called Butterfly Lovers with the Singapore Chinese Orchestra, which was a real treat. So it was great to actually see a violinist of his caliber with an orchestra of this caliber, because it's very interesting. If you've ever heard of Chinese orchestra, it's a combination of traditional instruments in addition to Chinese instruments, and the combination of the two is really, really special. And during the calibration and voicing process was very interactive with the conductor, the Singapore Chinese Orchestra. And you can see him there in the center of the photo. His name is Maestro Sung Ye. We spent about 5 days doing the calibration with the room empty. And then the next 4 days, we brought in the orchestra, and the maestro was actually conducting, but also helping us fine-tune all the presets. They had a list of all the presets they were looking for. There were 2 different stage configurations for where they placed the percussion. So this is one of the configurations you see here. Another one would be the percussions at the very back. So we actually had to do a couple of adjustments on the stage shell system to accommodate for that. Oh, no, it's not. It's actually just a close-up. It's a close-up of Maestro Sung Ye, but he was actually very familiar with Constellation because he was at the University of Indiana South Bend, where he was the music director. And we have a Constellation system in their small concert hall. So he was already familiar with it, and he was very instrumental in helping us get this project in the conference hall. So here's you see a scene that was taken from the voicing process, and that's Maestro that's at the back, who's pointing to the stage. He had a microphone, and he was conducting the orchestra from the hall because he wanted to walk around and hear how the reverberation was playing with the music. And he got very quickly very attuned to how we manipulate the reverberator inside Constellation. So he would tell me, okay, well, what is it set to? And I'd say, okay, it's about 1.6 seconds. And he'll say, okay, let's make it about 1.7. So I would make an adjustment. He's like, okay, perfect. And then we did that for 4 days. We looked at every possible ensemble, all stage configurations, soloists. At one point, they brought in some dramatic actors because they use this room as a drama hall as well. They also brought in a rock band. So we looked at every single possible preset, and it was a lot of fine tuning. And he would say, okay, this is a little too bright. Can you make it a little bit, reduce the brightness a little bit? So we make an adjustment. He's like, okay, yeah, lock it in. And then we would move on. So it was a lot of fun because I got to, experience all these amazing musicians, and it was very interactive. And, we always encourage, the participation of the orchestra when we do all these tunings.
That's great. And they've actually made of their own volition a stunning video that actually really sings the praises of the Constellation system. And Joshua Bell, gosh, I've known him for years. I used to work with him in my Decca days. He speaks very highly of the system. And it's great that he was able to work in this hall. The other thing that I think is worth pointing out with this hall is that although it's got carpet on the hall and that's not on the floor, and that's not normally people's first choice, the good news is that it won't change much when you fill it with people, I would imagine, because it's already very absorptive, the whole seating area.
Exactly, yeah. Okay, we'll move on to the next hall, which is the Stephen Tanger Center. So this is the most recent performing arts center that we've calibrated. It was actually done in March, right before the COVID lockdown happened. So we were able to get the tuning of the system done just in time before the whole country lockdown. So it's now the largest room in the United States with the Constellation system. So you can see it's a very large, 3,000 seats. It has a pretty deep balcony. But it's a beautiful venue. We worked with Arab out of New York for the acoustics. They did a fantastic job because this room starts around, I believe, 1.2 seconds, which is great for a room of this volume. We can see from this slide here is there's side balconies on the side. So there's different levels, and we're able to put some lateral energy on the different levels. And here we are in the under balcony. So very similar to Alexila and the other venues that John referred to. The under balcony has its own VRAS, it's its own zone, as we call it. And the idea is to make it match the acoustic of the room that's in front of the balcony. So that's always a very careful process. The end result is incredible because you could be sitting at the very back row that you see here, and you're still getting the same overhead energy in the envelopment that you would in front of the balcony. And of course, we have our usual electronic stage shell that's covering the entire stage as well. And here you get a view from the side seats of one of those side balconies. And there's always a very delicate kind of balance of making sure that the lateral seats here are well covered, but it's not too loud since you need to also cover the seats in the center. So during our voicing process, we did have the Greensboro Symphony play for us, which was great. We weren't able to get our conductor, who was Dmitry Sikovsky, but we did have the guest conductor that was kind of helping us, and we were walking on stage and working with the musicians and making some adjustments to suit the musicians, and as well as making adjustments in the hall as well.
So can you remember how wide this hall is, Pierre?
I would say it's
wide, isn't it? It's a monster.
It's definitely over 30 meters, maybe 40.
Yeah. I was going to take a guess at 35, but it's pretty big.
It is. Yeah. It is. And this room will be used for everything from Broadway musicals, rock shows, stand-up comedy, in addition to the Greensboro Symphony.
That's great. Well, thank you very much for sharing all that with us, Pierre. It's great. I'm really pleased that these projects have been a success. I just want to finish now with a couple of things. I just would like to remind everybody why it's really worth installing Constellation and thinking about it right from the get-go when you're making a new building. Apart from it being a complete package of equipment and services, and the fact that it can be installed with minimal visual and architectural impact, it really can save a huge amount of money in construction costs, because you can build smaller buildings and actually have the same quality of acoustics that you'd find in a music variety if you want to choose that preset. And of course, that's environmentally good. The equipment has very low running costs. Its quiescent current is very low. It doesn't use a lot of power. And in fact, one of our customers did a test and realized that running the Constellation system was actually no more greedy than running a regular PA in terms of power consumption, which is good news. And of course, it's easy to change things around with Constellation without a lot of staff. In the hall in Tallinn, the Alexila Hall, colleague Argus, who runs the technical side of the hall, can rig and de-rig the stage system in about a couple of hours on his own. He doesn't need anybody's help, whereas a big, heavy shell can actually take a crew of 4 or 5 people a couple of days to put in if it's a real monster. So that's a real benefit. You know, you can have many different types of events in a day. You can, if you need to, not that you probably would, but you could have a drama event in the morning, a rock concert in the afternoon, a classical orchestra concert in the evening. And I don't know, I think the musical theatre would probably have to wait to the next day because everyone would be exhausted, but you get the idea. So there's lots and lots of different things that you can do with Constellation just by literally pressing buttons, and you don't need a big crew in order to bring about those changeovers. So I've got 3 quotes I'd like to show you, and I'll let you read them. This is Christian Tetzlaff, who's a wonderful, wonderful violin player, just fantastic guy. And you can see what he says there. It's very simple. But I also like this quote from Jenny Coe, that for her, the sound of my violin had a beautiful warmth reminiscent of the finest performance venues in the world. And that, I think, is quite something for an artist of that caliber to say. And lastly, I really like what Nancy Bechtel, who's the former president of San Francisco Symphony, says, that we can not only support our current dreams, but those yet to be imagined by the next generation of artists and leaders. Thank you all very much, Pierre. Thank you so much for contributing to this as well. Back to you, Merlijn.
We would like to offer you the opportunity to ask any questions to today's speakers. So we have a question from Tony, who is asking, how terrible will the Constellation idea be for a finished auditorium in terms of cost and acoustic correction mechanism?
What I would say to that is that if a venue has very poor acoustics, we need to know what that problem is. And you also need to obviously have an acoustic consultancy on board who can look at the problem and see how to fix it. It might be, if the room is over reverberant, of course, you could add some absorption, carefully thought out, or it might be that there are flutter echoes, and those can also be dealt with in certain ways. But regardless of what the problem is, you need to fix the problem in order to install Constellation. We can't fix a bad room with Constellation alone. We have to physically fix it first. And often those fixes are not expensive. They can be reasonably inexpensive because, unlike physical acoustics, the kind of corrections that we need for Constellation are often comparatively inexpensive materials. So once we've done that, then we can go in and we can treat the room in the way that we normally would with the Constellation system. But of course, we want to get the reverberation time down so that you can have your rock concert. So I mean, the whole point of Constellation is that you really can have a rock concert and it sounds great because the reverberation time of the room is reasonably low. Then having done that, you can add Constellation to give you all of the reverberation times you want, up to 3 seconds or more, depending on the type of event you're hosting.
Thank you, John. We have a follow-up question, which is the Constellation system the best solution for building with acoustic problems?
I would say yes. Yeah,
yes.
Like John was saying, yeah, there are 3 main concerns when there's acoustic problems. One is either too much reverberation or not enough. If it's too much, then that can be addressed by adding acoustic treatment, like John was saying. The other one is the noise floor. You might have a noisy HVAC system. It could be environmental noise. Might be next to a highway or an airport. So that's the building shell that attenuates that noise, in addition to silencers, mechanisms to make the HVAC noise lower. And the other are the reflections that John was talking about. You can have different flutter echoes that are happening. That's what you get in parallel surfaces. If you're in a room with parallel walls. If you clap your hands, you're going to hear what I mean. But there's also sometimes on stage, you might get this big reflection from the balcony coming back. And those are all very addressable. And those are all things that, we have an acoustic guidelines document that we work with the architects and acousticians on. And we look for the major problems to be remedied, and then Constellation can then be added to extend reverberation time and create all those different spaces that we're talking about.
First and foremost, I would like to thank today's speakers, which were Pierre Germain, Meyer Sound's Constellation design manager, as well as our host, John Pellowe, Meyer Sound's project director for Constellation. Thank you to the both of you. Much appreciated. It was a truly interesting webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Merlijn.
Thank you, Merlijn.
Thank you to everybody.
As always, a recording of this webinar will be available on our Thinking Sound YouTube channel within the next couple of hours. Please remain safe, please stay healthy, and best to you and your loved ones.